Pursuant to the House Resolution 1370, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, and a member opposed shall each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
The amendment that I have at the desk is designed to prohibit funds for FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which subsidizes transmission to renewables. And there's a certain order number 1920. Now, the thing is that a lot of Americans don't really know what the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is or does, but it plays a massive role in their lives. It's an agency that regulates the interstate transmission of natural gas, oil, and electricity, but President Biden has appointed a lot of commissioners to advance his climate agenda. In May, FERC approved order number 1920, which will force everyday Americans to subsidize the cost of transmission lines so renewable energy developers can reap the benefits of billions of dollars in federal subsidies. Now, just so everybody can understand what's going on, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, while we are $35 trillion in debt, while our economy was reeling in the wake of a massive economic shutdown of our economy in response to the pandemic, in Congress's infinite wisdom, it passed the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, in which we massively subsidize and fund predominantly Chinese companies and billion-dollar companies here in the United States to advance openly what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to advance with respect to pushing their climate agenda. So we are going to subsidize our enemies, undermine our natural resources and strengths to produce American natural gas, American oil, American cars, the internal combustion engine, and in doing so, we're going to drive up the costs of all American families' goods and services and ability to carry out their lives. Now here, in order to carry out the fantasy that our radical progressive Democratic colleagues want to push on the American people, much like they tried to jam the metric system on me when I was in elementary school. They want to jam onto the American people this absurdity, and they're going to say now, not only do you have to eat a more expensive electric vehicle, not only do you have to have an unreliable grid, not only do you have to subsidize China and your enemies, oh no, you get to go even further. This is going to force electricity ratepayers, that means you, Americans, to pay for the cost of transition lines to renewable projects which will make unreliable energy allegedly more available. But guess what? On a cloudy, windless day, you still need that wonderful natural gas, coal, and nuclear power to power your homes or power all of your magic unicorn electric vehicles that power you around the country. Meanwhile, those electric vehicles are piling up on the lots of dealerships. Now you're reading articles where 50% of the people who own electric vehicles today are saying, oh gosh, I don't think I'll do that anymore. I'm going to sell them. And yet, we also have this administration about to jam the American people with a rule saying that you're going to have 2/3 of the fleet in our country be electric by 2032. This is an administration, and these are radical progressive Democratic colleagues who are at war with the American family. I believe we should defund this. That's what my amendment does. And with that, I will reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Is there any member that claims time in opposition? For what purposes, the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
First thing I would like to say to the gentleman from Texas is that our country is going to probably have 400 million people by 2050, and we are going to have to make some changes to accommodate them. We may not agree on what those are, but we can't live in 1950. It just simply isn't that nation anymore. So this amendment prohibits funds for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Order Number 1920. And that is a transmission and cost allocation rule that requires the nation's transmission providers, the providers, to plan for the transmission we know we will need in the future. I live in a region that was wiped out back about, the early 2000s. And what happened was one energy company goofed, and they turned off a switch, and it blacked out the entire Midwest, Northeast, and Canada, costing us $9 billion in economic activity and 9 lives that were lost. Now, it was upsetting that the grid was so integrated that we couldn't save the Ohioans that were damaged in that situation. But I felt the transmission was old back then, and I know it's old now. So the FERC Order 1920 is a transmission and cost allocation rule that requires the nation's providers, of the transmission providers, to plan for the transmission we know we will use in the future. And frankly, we need it right now. This rule adopts specific requirements addressing how transmission providers must conduct long-term planning for regional transmission facilities and determine how to pay for them so that the needed transmission is built. This rule was the first time in more than a decade that FERC has addressed regional transmission policy, and boy, can we be a witness to that in the Midwest. We know when it wasn't there. We could see the lines just sag when the outage occurred. To maintain a reliable electric grid and ensure that we meet our growing clean energy demands, studies show we may need to expand transmission by 60% by 2030. A resilient and reliable energy grid is also critical in confronting extreme weather and climate events that will only increase in severity. We see them every month. It is clear that we need to improve how our country plans, pays for, and builds the electric grid of the future. Finally, this rule was developed and voted on by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an independent agency that regulates the interstate transmission of electricity, natural gas, and so on. The final rule reflected more than 15,000 pages of comments from nearly 200 stakeholders, the ones that could understand how to submit comments. This rule is one step in the much larger complex puzzle to ensure that we have a reliable and efficient electric grid as our nation's energy needs change in the coming decades. A lot of people around this country, they're producing on property now. They don't need to go up to the grid. Maybe if things happen on their property, they have to bring down power from the grid. That ability has to be there too. But I strongly urge my colleagues to vote against this harmful amendment and help us prepare for the future, for heaven's sake. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would note that FERC Commissioner Mark Christie exposed this rule for what it is. Quote, the final rule inflicts staggering costs on consumers by promoting the construction of trillions of dollars of transmission projects, not to serve consumers in accordance with the Federal Power Act, but to serve a major policy agenda never passed by Congress to serve the profit-making interests of developers of politically preferred generation, primarily wind and solar, and to serve corporate, quote, green energy, end quote, preferential purchasing policies. Chuck Schumer basically admitted this, saying the order is, quote, what we need to see the clean energy revolution we catalyzed with the Inflation Reduction Act come to fruition, end quote. This is an agenda. This is not about 1950. This is about 2050. You need clean burning natural gas to actually power our houses, our homes, our hospitals, our lives. You need to have reliable power. We ought to have more nuclear power. We can do that, and we're working on that. But you shouldn't be having these fanciful energy policies that are being put out there, mandated on the American people, that are crippling families. That's the truth. In the quest for this radical agenda, you're empowering our enemies, and you're absolutely destroying the American family who can't afford an electric vehicle that costs $17,000 more than the internal combustion engine. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from